Hello everyone, how you guys doing? Hopefully you guys are having a wonderful day, and today we are here with a video on if Zulrah is dead content in old school RuneScape, a video I desperately need to make because I love Zulrah so much, so I have to let my feelings be heard. So until now, Zulrah has been an amazing money-making method in the game. A lot of people farm this boss for a good amount of time up until the last few years where Jagex has really tweaked the drop table, and on top of that, tweaked how some of the items work from that drop table, which has had a really bad backlash effect in terms of how Zulrah is seen in the current meta of the game today. So in this video, I wanted to go ahead and take a look at really how good or how bad it is and where Zulrah really ranks in terms of comparable money-making methods in the game. Most people think of Vorkath, and that's the one I'll be using primarily because I feel like they are pretty good partners in terms of kind of how people see progression in PVM. And I want to preface all this by saying that Zulrah is a really tough boss to learn and is supposed to be a player's real first challenge in PVM, in my opinion, at least a significant challenge, a significant step up in terms of what you can expect from bossing at, the early game with KBD and other things of the like where you're not really doing too much, like Barrows, Kraken, and stuff like that, where it's very easy PVM. Zulrah is really the first hard hit that you get that you really have to step up your game. And that's why I feel like it's so important to have it be a staple or a pillar of the med game PVM experience, because it really is something that helps you progress and kind of grow as a PVMer. So to look at where we are now, we have to understand how we got here. So to start, the whole real downfall began with the nerfing of the normal drop table here at Zulrah. In early 2017, when Zulrah drops were nerfed to a large degree, it seemed pretty reasonable at the time. Honestly, most people were farming Zulrah for their main source of money because, again, this is 4 years ago, so it's not like there was a ton of other med to late game content. At this point, we've seen a lot of other additions that are really, really good. Something like Vorkath is absurdly good in terms of GP per hour. You also have Volcano. You have a bunch of different versions of raids, and of course you have added monsters beyond that, but the game has progressed a lot. So in that sense, you don't have to look for Zulrah as much as you used to. So in my opinion, at the time, it was justifiable that they nerfed the drop table because it did seem so much better than everything else that was around it, especially when you consider that at the time, the Serpentine helm was the best in slot melee helm, essentially. The Toxic Blowpipe was as, OP as ever, and you have the Trident of the Swamp that you can go ahead and get here. So 3 really important pieces of anyone's gear setup was attainable through Zulrah. Now at this point in the current standing, the Serpentine helm, not the best helm. Toxic Blowpipe also got a good nerf. The Trident still good, but not anything that's going to make it insanely worthwhile. So at the time, they had best in slot items. They also had endless alchables, and this was really just an OP combo that Jagex had to do something about. You can't farm alchables and really good items into the game at the same time. Ideally one or the other. So they decided to go ahead and step back in terms of the alchables that you would get per hour. Now I mentioned the nerf to the blowpipe, but this actually had a residual effect just beyond the nerf to the blowpipe, because the blowpipe price is of course going to go down with that, but on top of that, the blowpipe was the main thing consuming all of these scales that were coming into the game, and so you would put a premium on those scales to then fund your blowpipe. Now the blowpipe isn't as, worthwhile, so the scales have come down in price accordingly, and a good bit at that. Now, again, I understand why they have to do this in the sense that the game needed some other range weapons. They needed to lower the ceiling of the blowpipe because honestly, it was so good. Now, that should have been done sooner. Sure, you could argue that, but at the end of the day, that's not what this video is about. This is really about the impact that it ended up having on the Zulrah loot table. As I mentioned before, dropping the price of the blowpipe, but on top of that, dropping the price of the scales, which you get scales every single kill. So it's kind of a reliable source of income if it's actually worthwhile. Back whenever scales were worth 150, 200 GP, and around there, every kill you could expect between 20, 40K just in scales alone. And so that actually has a pretty good baseline. Now that that's dropped substantially, that's no longer the case. Another important factor as to how we got here was that bots were running rampant. Honestly, if you remember, there are certain times where Jagex just could not handle them. You could just tell that there was so many bots, and honestly, scale prices would just tank for no foreseeable reason, and that would be because, it's just getting botted endlessly. Now, typically this happens in waves. There'll be a wave of bots that come in, Jagex will then start to take notice, they'll ban a good amount, and then, we kind of play this hide and seek game where bots just kind of float in and out through Zulrah. So that's always been something we've had to keep an eye out for. It was rumored at one point that they could lock Zulrah behind Song of the Elves, which in my opinion made a ton of sense. I'm not sure why that never did end up happening. At this point, Zulrah isn't as OP as it was, so I'd imagine it's less of a factor. But even then, I feel like that sort of change would be insanely valuable in the sense that if anyone wanted to bot it in the future, they would have to, build a really nice account and then risk that really nice account to then be able to bot Zulrah. So I think that if they were to upgrade Zulrah, make it a bit better and fit it more into the meta of the game, they could do so if they locked it behind something like Song of the Elves. And another downside that I haven't yet mentioned is that because the blowpipe got nerfed, thus dropping scale prices, that also drops the prices of the other uniques on the table, because the Magic Fang, the Tanzanite Fang, and the Serpentine Visage can all be dismantled into Zulrah scales, and those Zulrah scales, once they're less in price, then would cause the uniques to go down in price, because there's so many of the uniques that they're not really valuable for what they do, they're valuable because they can be turned into scales. So, not only did the scales take a hit, the uniques took a hit, and the regular drop table has taken a hit at this point, so everything has reduced substantially. So that's the backstory on how we've gotten here and how the situation has arrived where it has. Now I'm going to compare Vorkath to Zulrah and kind of show you why I think that Zulrah has just entirely lost its place in the game. So for a while, Zulrah and Vorkath were kind of seen as almost the same thing in terms of GP per hour. Personally, I used to say back in the day that, it's kind of just do whatever you like because they make essentially the same amount of money. And I would kill Zulrah because, I find it to be more enjoyable and more entertaining boss fight, but I don't think that's any more the case. So now if we look at the GP per hour for both of these, it actually will appear pretty close, but I'll explain why that isn't the case. So for Zulrah, maybe you get 30 kills per hour, which is a really high amount, and the average loot per kill is 102k. That means you come out to about 3 mil GP per hour. With Vorkath, 25 kills per hour, again, a pretty high amount. You could definitely do higher, but a pretty high amount. The wiki says 121k per kill, so we'll use that, and that puts us at 3.25 mil per hour. So Zulrah actually technically makes a little bit more. Now in this situation, I'd imagine that Zulrah, it's probably harder to reach 30 kills per hour than it is with Vorkath at 25. Really depends on your gear, your setup, your experience, all of that. But I'd say if anything, Zulrah is bumped up higher here than it should be, because I wanted to give it that nice edge. I wanted it to make it seem worthwhile. But in reality, is that the case? Probably not. Because not only is it hard to attain that amount of kills per hour, on top of that, with Zulrah, you do have to use teleport tabs if you're going to get that amount of kills per hour, and those teleport tabs are going to come in at least 300k per hour. Beyond that, there's another 250k plus GP per hour that you're going to have to spend on these Zulrah supplies that you use, because there are just so much more supplies being used there, rather than at Vorkath, where it's just some bolts, or maybe you're even using a Dragon Hunter Lance, and you honestly barely have to use anything other than some food and some potions. So if we account for that alone, Zulrah's already 500k below Vorkath, and I've done everything I can to make Zulrah look worthwhile. I'd imagine, if anything, it's even going to be more than 500k per hour below at these rates. On top of that, you cannot be assigned a Zulrah task. Like with Vorkath, you can get a Blue Dragon's task and then go kill 150 of them with essentially 0 times Slayer XP, because you're making really good GP per hour, so you probably don't care about the Slayer XP as much. And with that, the thing I haven't even mentioned yet is that Zulrah is so much harder to learn. Just infinitely harder to learn than Vorkath is. With Vorkath, all you have to do is just shoot the boss. Whenever it throws a fireball at you, you move, and whenever there's green stuff on the ground, you don't run over it. And as long as you do that, you're fine. I couldn't teach anyone how to do Zulrah in a nice 2 to 3 sentence little instruction. There's just no way. There's 4 different rotations. You have to have constant gear switching. You have to stand in the right spots. You have to have a good inventory set up with a lot of different things that you can just switch to at a moment's notice. And that's just so much more intense than something like Vorkath, which again, I've already demonstrated makes significantly more GP per hour. So personally, I find this disheartening, because as someone who has experienced Zulrah during its peak and kind of seeing what the game is like, I think it's just so much more enjoyable. I think that the game should incentivize people to, go down a route that is a little bit tougher to learn. Zulrah's a really hard grind to kind of get into, while with Vorkath, again, it's just something you kind of plug and play. You really know what to do from the start. There's not too much to it. While with Zulrah, people struggle. They really have to try to improve and become a better player, and I think that you should be rewarded accordingly for that, and at the moment that is just not the case. And I will acknowledge that Vorkath is locked behind Dragon Slayer 2, but as I mentioned earlier in this video, I could easily see Zulrah being locked behind Song of the Elves, and if that was the case, essentially they're on the same playing field at that point. Of course, not the way it currently is in game, but again, I think of this more in a bossing perspective, that Zulrah is much, much harder to learn and figure out than Vorkath is, so that's where the real imbalance is at. And finally, I just find it disheartening because I do want people to, better themselves, not only in game, but in real life, and be encouraged to take on challenges, and for people to not have that incentive here and rather just go the easy route and print more money. It doesn't make a lot of sense, and it's just a little saddening on my end. And you may be wondering, well, how could this be fixed? I mean, I'm going to offer very baseline solutions, but I think they make sense. You could nerf Vorkath's drops, because personally I see that is the main way people are going to go at the med level boss in game. And so if that's kind of their default all the time, it's not something I'm a fan of, because I really do find the boss to be a bit boring. So I'd rather people, want to vary it up a good bit. And so you could nerf Vorkath to make that happen. On top of that, you could go the opposite way and buff Zulrah, which at this point I think is more than justified, because we've seen all these price drops, and if you just added some more alkables to their table, I think that'd be great, because honestly there are a lot of really bad drops at Zulrah, while at Vorkath you rarely ever have that. And if you're gonna buff Zulrah, like I mentioned before, you could lock it behind Song of the Elves. I'm not sure what the repercussions would be in terms of people that have already killed Zulrah and then might have to go do Song of the Elves to then get the rest of the access that they're going to need. I don't know how that all works out, but Jagex has thought about locking it behind Song of the Elves in the past, so if they've thought about it, I'd assume it's definitely doable, and in that case, I think it's reasonable to go ahead and go forward with it. And finally, before I round it out here, there's nothing wrong with admitting that the game needs tweaked a bit. It happens from time to time depending on how the metas are kind of flowing in the game, and so this isn't a hit piece on anything in particular. This isn't to say that anyone did something horribly bad. It's just kind of a combination of a lot of things at large that have come together to make the current situation we're in, and from there we can only do our best to figure it out. So that is essentially it for this video. Just wanted to share my thoughts on the matter and kind of make a little update video, because I know I've done a lot of Zulrah versus Vorkath comparisons in the past, and at this point we're in an entirely different game. So wanted to do a nice video on that. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. If you did, make sure to leave a like. Would love to hear your opinions on the subject down below in a comment. And on top of that, if you want to see more videos like this as soon as I go live, make sure to subscribe. Also plenty of links you can check me out at down below, and I'd appreciate it greatly. But with that said, hopefully you guys have a wonderful day, and peace.